Hello, good morning, and thank you for joining us today here in the room very early on a Saturday morning, and hopefully online as well in a better time zone. We're here for the session Take on Voices, a Safer World for the Truth, and we'll be speaking about journalist safety and press freedom today. I have several guests joining me, and we'll go into different countries, different regions, and speak about the topic. And we'll see some clips from two documentaries that were made about journalist safety in Afghanistan and India. And I'll tell a bit more about myself first. My name is Evelien Wijkstra. I work at Free Press Unlimited, which is a media development organization based in Amsterdam. We support journalists and independent media in more than 40 countries across the world. And unfortunately, we have seen the last couple of years how dire the situation for journalists has gotten. And we'll talk a bit more about that today. First, I'll ask my first two guests to join me on stage, Anu and Ilyas. Please join me. Thank you. So, Anu, let me start with you. Yes. Anu Sumana Nettar, she's my colleague from Free Press Unlimited. She works in the Gender Safety and Accountability team, and you work on South Asia mostly.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start very basic. What's the situation for journalists and independent media in the region you work on?
Thank you, Evelyn. This is a very important question. Just to give a picture of the region in a world context, on the RSF index, South Asian countries rank very low. This is not good news, of course. Yeah. The International Federation for Journalists, they recorded about 25 media rights violations just in a span of 1 month this year in the region, which included 5 detentions and killing of a journalist. So it's quite important that independent journalism exists, but this is becoming more and more difficult because of harsh regulations and laws. Yeah. Throughout South Asia, media is linked with businesses and politics, and there is a lack of trust within the population. But like I said, because of the laws and regulations, journalists are not able to exercise free journalism because it looks like there is a push to make only the state narrative count.
Yeah, exactly. So today we'll talk a bit more about India and the situation there. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What's the situation for journalists, independent media? How are they able to do their job? What type of threats they are faced with? Has it changed over the years, or is it pretty stable or not?
The situation in India is quite similar to the situations in other countries in the region. There are new laws that are being introduced. There are new clauses that are being added to guidelines to just make it more difficult for journalists to report against the governments. Yeah. For example, in Bangladesh, in 2021 alone, there were over 1,000 journalists that were charged simply under the Digital Security Act, whereas in comparison in 2020, there were about 100 journalists. Yeah. In India...
So that's a really steep increase in the use or kind of the misuse of these laws against journalists.
Absolutely.
And do you see also that this is a type of journalist that they're targeting specifically with these lawsuits, or is it really broad? Is it anyone who's critical?
It's anybody that is critical and does investigative journalism on government affairs. Yeah. And just to also throw some light on India, there are new clauses that have been introduced to the media accreditation guidelines. One of such clause is if a journalist writes about government affairs, it can be considered as going against the sovereignty and integrity of India. Yeah, exactly. And his accreditation can be revoked. So there is a very hard push on journalists that are going into investigative journalism and writing on government affairs.
Exactly. And do you see that this is a typical group of people? So these are really the courageous type of people that are able to still do that job?
we see that the number is reducing steadily, and it is very important now that we provide a good support and a support base, including the international community. There are online harassments from the troll armies. A good example is Rana Ayub, an Indian journalist who was intimidated. She received death and rape threats. There was something called a SLAP, which is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. She received a travel ban. And there are...
So they're really trying to make it really hard for her to do this job and to be critical of the government or whoever she's trying to hold to account.
Yes. Correct. And there are also any critique that is made from a journalist is received by trolling techniques. And there's a huge campaign that goes against them. It's also quite common in Pakistan, where the leaders and politicians, they vilify journalists. They call them peddlers of fake news. Their entire research and work is discredited on Twitter, on social media by politicians and leaders, which makes it more look like more, it has more weightage when readers look at it.
Exactly. Yeah, you must be very strong and very, I think, willing to give up a lot of things to do this type of journalism. I mean, if you look at Rana, the level of harassment she's faced with on a daily basis, it's I think it's very hurtful, and I think it's very. I think she even said she was at the Perugia Journalism Festival this week, and she said herself, I continue to do this job, but at the same time, as a person, it hurts me. Of course, I feel it, at times that it's really offensive, and you start to doubt yourself and what you're doing. So,
yes, absolutely.
And how can we support them? That's what we work on, of course. Maybe you can say a bit more about this. How can we support those journalists and those media and still continuing their work?
Yes, Free Press Unlimited has an emergency support fund where we support journalists in dire need of support. There are legal funds also available at Free Press Unlimited. And some of our partners in Pakistan, they also have locally set up legal funds. We as Free Press Unlimited also train journalists on digital and physical security. We provide psychosocial support.
That's very much needed, of course, in these situations where if you're confronted with this type of trolling, that you're not isolated and you get the support that's needed.
Precisely. I think we undermine the trauma, the PTSD that journalists face, and especially in Corona, journalists have seen, especially in India, people dying in front of hospitals because of lack of oxygen. So that has really pushed the journalists into a lot of pressure, and we also read that some journalists committed suicide. So a good support base in the country and outside is very important, and it calls for international support, lobbying for better regulations, and also to call out the governments and hold them accountable.
Yeah, exactly, to not use that type of rhetoric about journalists when they speak up. Thank you so much, it was very clear. Ilyas, you're a filmmaker from Afghanistan. Can you tell us a bit more about what's the situation in Afghanistan for filmmakers like yourself, but also journalists? I heard you're a former journalist. What's the situation now? I think everyone has heard about the Taliban takeover and the effect of that. But I think everyone's now turned to Ukraine, where the new crisis erupted. So it would be good to hear what's the situation now.
Thank you, Evelyn. But I'm afraid I can say Afghanistan is in a total media blackout at the moment. There is no actual reporting. There is no ground reporting coming from Afghanistan. And and at the same time, the narrative that the Taliban and the pro-Taliban media pushes somehow tackles even this vulnerable situation that's already been there. So since I left Kabul in July 2021, and when I left, I could count tens of journalists and tens of media activists and writers who were back there in the country and who were writing and who were trying to raise awareness. But in a blink of an eye, we just lost a generation
Yeah.
of journalists who were shaped there.
Exactly.
So based on Human Rights Watch, on September 2021, around 40% of the local media was closed, and 80% of female journalists lost their job. And so this data might have changed until now,
Yeah.
and changed to worse, I can say.
Yeah.
So basically, I can say that there were three channels of reporting back then: the local media, the international media, and the social media, the community who were actually reporting. What happened with the local media is that they are facing restrictions, and they are facing lots of new rules and laws by the
Yeah.
Taliban that disables them to actually report from what's going on.
Yeah, I
And-
believe they introduced certain rules for the media quite soon after their takeover, and these were quite fake, right? I mean, they
yeah,
were
it was
anything that's critical or anything that's
In September 2021, not even a month after they captured Kabul, they sent out newsletters to all the media inside Afghanistan, and there were like clauses in that letter which is very vague, like the media can't accuse and media can't report about any facts that may somehow may affect the picture of the
Yeah,
Taliban, and,
exactly.
and may affect what they call the values. So, and a few media that are currently operating inside Afghanistan, they are like very limited in terms of resources, and they are afraid of the security of their staff and their equipment. So basically, all the news that they reflect is somehow controlled by the Taliban. So and there's, when I say there is no real reporting, it means that we don't have journalists actually looking out for facts and looking out for stories.
No.
But they rather wait for the Taliban to hold a news conference or something, and to somehow reflect and react on the propaganda and on the reports that the Taliban either confirm or deny.
Yeah, exactly.
The international media, unfortunately, we have a long story with international media as a hub of war journalists for at least the past 40 years.
Yeah.
And we, as the new generation, think that the mainstream media has somehow shaped the narrative of Afghanistan and shaped the narrative of the war even. So we never owned our own narrative. But even although there was at least international media present who would observe the things happening here, which is now very limited, I can say.
Yeah.
All international media can do is they can interview Taliban fighters who are actually very attractive sometimes for them. Looking at these faces with these traditional clothes and AK-47s who have defeated the US attracts international media in a sense that it puts the rest of the country in a blackout.
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
not about the people's issues. It's about, covering what's interesting for their audiences and kind
yeah,
of...
well, it's really interesting having these heavily armed local fighters in the streets of vibrant Kabul,
Yeah.
and that's what they focus on.
them,
And that's actually
yeah.
what Taliban also want them to focus. They want to be seen, and at the same time, whenever an international journalist wants to try to report from Afghanistan, they are somehow directed, led to specific channels, led to specific resources that the Taliban may have already arranged that for them.
of course.
So there's no like freedom of movement for them. And then the social media, there was a wave of community reporting. There was a wave of Afghan citizens reporting about the issues, which shaped the whole bulletin of everyday's news in the local media, I can say. We had a very strong and we had a very active social media platforms in Afghanistan, which is now dying, I can say, because those who are inside the country, they fear of their lives and they can't report, and those who are outside, like us, we don't really have access to the resources and to the stories happening back there.
Yeah, exactly.
So all these elements gather together to put this country in a total media blackout,
yeah.
where we don't know what is actually happening there.
Yeah, exactly. And do you see, are there any exiled media, so actually newsrooms that have gone out and started to make their media and their content from abroad going into the country again, or is that not happening yet?
I know a few media outlets that have shifted to outside the country, and they are operating from exile, like my colleague Zaki Daryabi from one of the most read newspapers inside Kabul. But then it's also about the question of access. When you don't have physical access to the stories, it's really difficult to report.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And for you, like, what is your? Do you envision yourself going back to Afghanistan in the coming period, or are you not sure about that?
That is what I dream of almost every morning, but. It's a political decision, I can say. The decision that we left the country was also a political decision. Yeah. Beside the threat on our lives, we didn't want to stay on the same country and stay on the same streets and valleys that are occupied by a terrorist group. So on that regard, going back to the country is also a political decision to make. But nevertheless, that's our country, and we as filmmakers and journalists need to be there and need to tell stories and access the stories there. But it's going to be very difficult for us. And right now, there is no hope to actually go and film and report from there.
No, exactly. Well, thank you so much, both. I think this was a good introduction to the topics we're going to discuss more today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you. I think we're going to see a short clip from a documentary by Zaki Daryabi, who is a filmmaker and journalist from Afghanistan, and who we'll talk to shortly after that.
اطلاعات روز از اینمی شرایط بحرانی خود را نجات میده. وقتی میمونه اگر حتی این کار از کابل ممکن نباشه از کسی دیگر اینها را حتما حفظ میکنیم.
جنگجویان سرمست از پیروزی پرچم سیاه و سفیدشان را برافراشتند.
به نظرم که یکی دو روز آینده را دفتر نباشیم بهتره.
اگر حضورتون در خانه کم نکنه که آرام میشه یا الله
عاجل بیا دیگه لطفا، یعنی سرک چه دارلمان طالبان گرفته طرف خانه رفتن نمیشه. تو بیا هست بیا
اینمی فروپاشی میدی برای در موردش نمیشه میگه، ولی این صورت را هیچ حداقل در این جمع ما هیچ کس پیش بینی نمی‌کرد که به این صورت شکوار بوده. اون قصه خود قصه کشور یک شب است.
یک از آدرس‌هایی که بسیار زیاد معرض ریسک است اطلاعات روز است.
کلاً انفجار پوشش داده، جنگ پوشش داده، کسایی را که ما این کارها و جنایت‌هایشان پوشش داده بودیم حتما میکشن دیگه ما.
فعلا نگرانی است که یک دفعه از اینجا براییم که نمانیم و وضعیت به یک جایی نرسه که مثلا زندگی در خطر باشه.
خب طرفایتون نام طالبان چک نکرد؟ حالا کچای دیگه میگه کامده آتوال طرف نامده.
صدای شلیک میه خیلی نزدیکه. احساس نمیکنی خیلی کار جسورانه ای کردی که امروز آمدی سر کار؟
نه کار جسورانه نیه، حق ابتدایی میم. یعنی چی کار جسورانه؟ دانشگاه خواندم، مکتب خواندم، اینجی وظیفه گرفتیم. یادم کلگین از صفر شروع که از خانه بیرون نشد دیگه وحشتناک کنه.
دیگه ما شاهد چی نیستیم. رنگ‌های متنوع، تیپ‌های متنوع. متاسفانه ایدئولوژی علمی است. ایدئولوژی میخواد همه چیز یک دست میدونی؟
من این فهرست ابتداییش آماده کردم، اگر با مشکلی بر نخوره این 10 نفر اول را میدیمایی است که از کابل یه هفته بیرون میشه.
یکی دی استاد چه دونزو تکیه کده نه در وقت پرواز خو همه باید بشینه
فوتوشاپ نمی؟
نه
مگه فقط یک شب تا 3 صبح خلوت میشه از او هجوم و همهمه و وحشت یک مقدار کم میشه.
یعنی نظامی داریم که خروج کنیم؟
هنوز میره مید باقی است دیگه چی میشه بریم جلیل
یک پیشنهاد دارم یک مقدار پوشش رو بیشتر کنیم و یک مقدار چالشی کنیم. اطلاعات روز اگر اون شجاعت نداشته باشد، اگر محتوای تولید نکنه یا گزارش ها و تحلیل منتشر نکنه که یک مقدار آگاهی بخش باشه، یک مقدار آگاهی خلق کنه در جامعه، دیگه در حقیقت او اطلاعات روز وجود نداره. برای اطلاعات روز بقا و محتوای شکسته هر دوش یکسان است.
ما میگفتیم که ما خبرنگاریم و با یک نوع تحقیر میگفتن فیلم برداری میکنیم. حالا دیدیم فیلم برداری چطوره؟ ترس از اینکه ما رو بکشه هر لحظه ما رو خفه میکرد، نمیتونستم نفس بکشم، گوشیم را حس میکردم که از بین رفته چون کار نمیکرد، اصلا نمیشنیدم گوشیم و نمیتونستم با پهلوی راست بخونم.
میخوایم بگوییم که اطلاعات روز حالش خوب نیست.
جبهه مقاومت ملی به زودی سخنگوی جدید خود اعلام نموده و بار دیگه اعلام میکنه که شهادت افتخار ماست و به هیچ عنوان شهید دادن و همچنین فشارهای بالای جغرافیا آوردن از روحیه ما نمیکاهد.
هر اتفاق ممکن است. ما باید یا نجات بدیم. صادقانه احساسی ناتوانی میکنیم که اگر این کار نکنیم بعد از 10 سال کار. میخوایم این اتفاق بیفته و همکارای ما بیرون بره.
Hi, Saki. Thank you for joining us. I think it's the middle of the night for you, so I hope you can hear us well. Thank you. We just watched a small clip from the documentary about your independent newspaper back in Kabul last August, I believe. How are you now?
Hello everyone. Just seen the short clip. It just brings a lot of memories that I passed through many months in Kabul, and absolutely in a decade that I was in Kabul as a journalist.
Yeah, I can imagine this must be painful as well. You set up the newspaper, the independent newspaper, Etilat Rus, I think more than 10 years ago. You probably did not imagine this happening, of course. Why did you set up the newspaper back then?
I just want to say that it's a decade that Etilat Rus is working as independent newspaper in the country. After a decade that we were active in the country and after 2 decades of presence of international community, the government collapsed in Afghanistan, but the journalism and independent media didn't collapse. I see that every day there's a lot of reports coming from the country, across the country, every provinces in many outlets include Etilat Rus. I didn't know that how long does it take that we can reactive again Ethelatos. And now I see that every day we have a lot of reports across Afghanistan, include many provinces. When I was in Kabul, we just had 4 provincial journalists, but now we have more than 10. And that's why I'm telling that government collapsed, but the media didn't collapse. I see that we just changed the activities in some kinds of reports, but I know that it's a long way for independent media and journalists, but we will rise again, and we are working to active again what we were before: investigative reports, storytelling, video journalism, and many things. But now I see that a lot of my colleagues and another journalists are in danger, and they are not sustainable. And we are looking to find a way for the future of journalism that will be sustainable more than what we see now.
Yeah, exactly. You need to survive, of course, financially as well to do the work. In the small clip, we saw that you were saying, "No, I hope I can get my colleagues out. These people that have worked for us for a long time." Did they manage to go out?
No, unfortunately, I defeated on that.
Yeah.
Many of them got out, but many of them are still in Kabul. Many of them are still in provinces. They are very famous, include many good investigative reporters, and I defeated on that.
Yeah, exactly. And so they still are able to do the work, but not in the same way as before. Do I understand that correctly? So they're still reporting?
Some of them working with Ethelatos, but some of them just leave the organization because they feel that it's my fault and I couldn't do something for them to evacuate them. But I think it was a lot of technical things. It was not on my hand.
No.
So I just need to make a decision. Then we just started to hire some new journalists, but anonymous people, because everything is changed. So many of the journalists who are working with Ethelatos, we didn't share their names, and they work with us anonymously.
Yeah, exactly. And you say, I do see some hope for the future because there's still some journalism alive. And I think after a decade, you've also grown a medium, you've grown a culture of journalism as well, and a culture of speaking out. Can you tell us a bit more about the hope you see and what you hope that will happen in the coming period?
The first thing that I see as a hope is this that the government with a lot of money just collapsed in Afghanistan. But journalism during a hard time in the past months, while there was a lot of torture of journalism, they detained journalism, they tried to destroy the infrastructure for the media and freedom of expression in Afghanistan, and they tried to bring a lot of restriction against media. They just ignore the law, but we still have a lot of reports from Afghanistan, from the national media. So this is the first one. Then the second is, while many of my colleagues are trying to just leave Afghanistan, we every day face with a lot of requests that are trying to be freelance journalists for Etel Atros in many other media organizations. There's a lot of women and also demands that are trying to help the media. Then we receive a lot of reports from the citizens. Then they are trying to share their voice in the story of Afghanistan through national media and international media. They're trying to be part of a big narrative that we fought for in past 2 decades. And I see that there's a lot of hopes, but unfortunately, it's not sustainable if we don't have a support for international community, especially the organizations who fight for freedom of expression, and they're trying to support this. I see that many organizations just left Afghanistan. The organization who found the media, who just supported the freedom of expression in Afghanistan, but they just left the country. I think we need the support, and it's very important to be a backbone for freedom of expression in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I completely agree. Is there any sign that they will be returning, these organizations, or is that very unclear still? Because I think it's also a call for us to speak to them. From my organization, Free Press Unlimited, we have kept saying again and again, we shouldn't only focus on getting people out of Afghanistan, but we should also focus on, ensuring that there is a free flow of information, that there's still journalists supported to do the work. So exactly what you're saying now, we need to ensure that all of this investment and also kind of the culture that was created, which is seen now with actually citizens engaging also with you and telling the stories, that should be maintained. And I think that's something, I take that as a clear cue for us to also keep on saying, and don't forget that is really necessary. But do you feel like these organizations are listening to that already, the ones that were inside the country and doing this work, or did they leave and they just wait for any stable government? Because I think that's also an issue with, a lot of the governments that we deal with, that they're saying, we don't want to engage with the Taliban, so that makes it very hard to actually, go back into the country, start an embassy again. But at the same time, you leave the people, of course, and how it's a hard balance to strike, I think.
Yeah, that's why I'm here, to ask that Free Press Unlimited at least come to Afghanistan. It's time that you should come to Afghanistan, because digital security in the way that we face now is important that you should come in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I, as editor-in-chief, didn't know does Free Press Unlimited was in Afghanistan or not, but it's time that you should come to help the journalists and the media organizations. And we also call every other organizations that work for free press, for freedom of expression. Then I see that many journalists, editor-in-chiefs, and who just left Afghanistan are trying to collaborate with each other to convince the world and to work together to help the local journalists and to keep the flow of information alive from Afghanistan, and to be a kind of backbone for what we achieved in the area of freedom of expression in past 2 decades. So I'm hopeful that we can arrange to convince the organizations that what we achieved in Afghanistan for freedom of expression in the independent media is very, very important. So what's raised in Afghanistan in the area of free media, it is uncomparable with a lot of countries. The government, the politicians can lose everything, but we, as a field for freedom of expression, should not let that what we achieved in Afghanistan be alone.
Exactly. Yeah.
With a dictatorship government, with a government that didn't respect the law, didn't understand what's freedom of expression. But I think we can manage together, and I'm hopeful.
Great. We'll make sure to support you in that. Just to make sure, we're going to open up for questions after, but I think it might be nice for you to go back to sleep. So if there's any questions for Zaki at this time, please post those at this time. I'm not able to see anyone, but is there a mic if that's necessary? I don't believe there's any. Thank you so much, Zaki, for joining us, and I wish you good luck with the documentary. I look forward to seeing the whole version, and let's be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll switch to India now. We'll start by watching a small clip of the documentary by Kavita Lankesh, who's here today, and who will join me on stage after that.
Well-known journalist Gauri Lankesh has been shot dead at her
രാത്രി
home
8 മണിയോടുകൂടിയാണ്
in
ബംഗളൂരു
Bengaluru.
രാജരാജേശ്വരി
Police
നഗറിലെ
commissioner has
വീട്ടിൽ വെച്ച്
confirmed
ഗൗരി
the
ലങ്കേഷിനെ
incident
അക്രമി സംഘം
reports
വെടിവെച്ച്
that
കൊലപ്പെടുത്തിയത് വീടിന് പുറത്തുനിന്ന് എത്തി കാറിൽ നിന്ന് ഇറങ്ങി വീടിനകത്തേക്ക് കയറുമ്പോഴായിരുന്നു അക്രമി സംഘം വെടിയുതിർത്തത്. സംഭവ സ്ഥലത്ത് വെച്ച് തന്നെ ഗൗരി ലങ്കേഷ് കൊല്ലപ്പെട്ടു. 7 വെടിയാണ് അക്രമികൾ ഉതിർത്തത്. ഇതിൽ 4 എണ്ണം ലക്ഷ്യം തെറ്റി വീടിന്റെ ഭിത്തിയിൽ തറച്ചു.
ಏನು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಮಾಹಿತಿಗಳು ಲಭ್ಯ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಪೊಲೀಸರು ಕೂಡ ಇದೀಗ ನಡೆದಿರುವಂತಹ ಘಟನೆ ಆಗಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಬರೀ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕದವರ ಮನೆಯವರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಂತಹ ಮಾಹಿತಿಗಳು.
For Gauri, I think this was a natural transition, her involvement in the Baba Bundgiri issue. It just couldn't have been otherwise. When she was actually working in the national media, the English language newspaper in Delhi, she had covered the events leading to the demolition of Babri Masjid, which, as we all know, is a watershed moment in the rise of the right wing in India. That was in 1992. 8 years later, when our father died in 2000, Gauri came back to her home state in Karnataka and took over Lankesh Patrike, which my father used to run. Reluctantly, I must say, but she was compelled to. Now, Gauri here also saw the same pattern of events happening in Baba Bundgiri, trumpeted as the Ayodhya of South by the right wing. And Lankesh Patrike had the legacy of actively being in opposition to any ruling government. So when she started running the paper and with all the other events happening around her, she jumped right into the thick of the events. That is what I mean by saying it was completely natural for her. She couldn't have remained just an observer. That's why she became so passionately involved in it.
We, the people of Karnataka Communal Harmony Forum, that we are asking for, let there be harmony and peace, that we are arrested, and the very fascist forces which are out to destroy the secular fabric of the state are being allowed to carry on their parade and everything else in the city of Chikmagalur today. But this is a fight we have been doing for the last 4 years, and we are determined that come what may, we will not allow the communalization of the state.
In 2005, if I'm not mistaken, here in Karnataka, we saw a series of violent attacks against the minorities, especially Christians and Muslims. In 2008, 20 churches were vandalized by people from these organizations, so-called organizations called Bajrang Dal, Sri Ram Sene, and etc., which are Hindu right-wing mobs claiming to be vigilante groups like the black shirts or brown shirts, And surprisingly, maybe not surprising, the police were in cahoots with them. The police were beating up Christians instead of controlling the mobs, and it was really insane. And Gauri was trying to be a sane voice, speaking for the minorities, arguing with the politicians and the ministers, writing furiously in her newspapers week on and week on. So she gradually came to be seen as one of the leading voices in the resistance against the right wing in our home state, Karnataka.
ಗೌರಿ ಲಂಕೇಶ್ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಒಳಗಡೆ ಕಳ್ಳರ ತರ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನೀವೇ ಲಂಕೇಶ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಅಂತೀವಿ, ಆದ್ರೆ ಅಮಾಯಕರು ಬಡಪಾಯಿಗಳದ
ನಕ್ಸಲ್ ಪರ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಯಾವುದೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಓಕೆ, ನಿಮ್ಮಷ್ಟೇನೆ ನಾನು ಮಲೆನಾಡಿನೊಳನೆ, ನಾನು ಶಿವಮೊಗ್ಗದವಳು, ನಮ್ಮ ಅಪ್ಪ ಅಮ್ಮ ಶಿವಮೊಗ್ಗದವರು, ನನಗೂ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕಾಳಜಿ ಇದೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಥರ ಓಕೆ, ಇವತ್ತು ನಕ್ಸಲ್ ಹೆಸರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಆದಿವಾಸಿಗಳನ್ನ ಕೊಲ್ಲೋದಾಗಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಆ ನಕ್ಸಲರು ಇಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಪೊಲೀಸ್ ಇನ್ಫಾರ್ಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಆದಿವಾಸಿನ ಕೊಲ್ಲೋದಾಗಲಿ ಎರಡೂ ತಪ್ಪು. ಪಾವಗಡನೂ ಖಂಡಿಸಿದ್ದೀವಿ ನಾವು, ಶೇಷಗೌಡನೂ ಖಂಡಿಸಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹಿಂಸೆ ಪರ ಅಂತಂತಲ್ಲ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಂತಿ, ನಿಮಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಶಾಂತಿ ಬೇಕು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಂತೀರೋ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಶಾಂತಿ ನಮಗೂ ಇರೋದು.
After this Maoists and Gauri's involvement in the whole issue, the right-wing's attack on her became more and more intense, and wherever Gauri had public meetings or a gathering, they would openly attack her or abuse her with words.
Transformation is such that starting from Kuvempu to URA, Kalburgi, my father, they're all trenchant critics of Jawaharlal Nehru, of Indira Gandhi, of Rajiv Gandhi, but let me say that none of them ever were physically attacked, let alone death threats. But now death threats has become a common factor in Karnataka.
Gauri was just not my sister, she was also my best friend and a good critique of all my works, you know. I used to make her go through all my film scripts before I started shooting, and she would share her articles before it got published. Almost every other weekend she would come home to spend time with us, and I realized that she would be spending time on a computer posting her comments about anti-Hindutva and also trying to rationalize with Modi supporters on social media. I came to know much later, of course, that she was being heavily abused and trolled on it because of her ideology and her belief in secularism and the constitution. Gauri and me shared the same office building, you know, and so I would regularly meet her almost every day, except of course when I was in a shoot or she was attending numerous protests and was busy with her writing or attending hundreds of court cases which were filed against her by the right wing. Gauri, I must say, was a great cook, but she hardly ever cooked because she didn't want to be labeled or put in a box of domesticity, as you would say. As she became more and more busy, I started taking food for her every day and dropping her off at the office. I really can't forget the casserole found in her car when she was assassinated that had her dinner in it still. I wish I could have scolded her one last time not to forget and to eat.
ಯಾವ ಕೋಮು ಸೌಹಾರ್ದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಆಶಿಸ್ತಾ ಗಾಂಧಿ ತಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನನೇ ಬಲಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು, ಯಾವ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಸಿಗದೆ ರೋಹಿತ್ ವೆಮುಲ ದೂಡಲ್ಪಟ್ನೋ, ಅದು ನಮಗೆ ಹತಾಶೆ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಡ್ದು. ಭಾರತನ ಒಂದು ಸೌಹಾರ್ದ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಾನತೆ ದೇಶ ಕಟ್ಟೋದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಪಣ ತೊಡೋಣ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ.
ಹೆಪ್ಪುಗಟ್ಟಿದ ನೋವು ಮೀಗಲೊಲ್ಲದು ನೋಡಿ, ಹೆಪ್ಪುಗಟ್ಟಿದ ನೋವು ಮೀಗಲೊಲ್ಲದು ನೋಡಿ.
ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಯಾಕಾಯ್ತು ಹೇಗಾಯ್ತು ಕೆಳದಿರಿ, ಉಸಿರು ನಿಲ್ಲುವ ಮುನ್ನ ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನನ್ನ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಅನೇಕ ಗೌರಿಯರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ನನ್ನ ಮಗಳು PUC ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಇಂಜಿನಿಯರ್ ಆಗಲಿ ಅಂತ ಆಸೆ ಇತ್ತು ನನಗೆ. ಪತ್ರಿಕೋದ್ಯಮ ಆರಿಸ್ಕೊಟ್ಲು, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಫುಲ್ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಒದಗಿಸಿಕೊಟ್ಲು. ಅವಳಂತ ಗೌರಿಯವ್ರನ್ನ ಹುಟ್ಟಾಕಿದ್ಲು, ಧೈರ್ಯದಿಂದ ಹೋರಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರೇರಣೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ಲು. ನನಗೆ ಹೆಮ್ಮೆ, ನಿಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೆಮ್ಮೆ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಗೌರಿ ನೀವು ನನ್ನ ಗೌರಿಯರು ಎಲ್ಲ ನನ್ನ ಗೌರಿಯರು ಅಷ್ಟೇ.
Now, 18 people have been charged with the murder. So far, 16 have been arrested and 2 accused are still absconding. Now, this charge sheet elaborates on the involvement of right-wing organisation Sanatan Sanstha and names Parshuram Wagmare as the prime accused who is said to have shot her.
Headquartered in Goa, the organization has offices in Panvel, Mumbai, Sangli and other parts of Maharashtra. Members affiliated to the group have been accused of carrying out bomb blasts, murder, issuing threats and even transporting explosives.
We took up investigations on the 6th evening itself. I visited first in the 6th evening, and then from 7th onwards we started visiting the scene of offence and we started collecting all the data and evidence which were there on the scene of offence. Discount, because there were no initial suspects, so we could not discount. We had to create a sub-investigation team to looking at each of them, like looking at the CCTV camera footage of nearly 5 to 10 kilometers in and around Bangalore. Similarly, for phone calls, separate team, separate computers, separate programming, only for this case. Imagine the data, 15 days of entire Bangalore city. It is humongous.
It's 4 years since Gauri is gone. And in 2019, 2 years after they killed Gauri, Mr. Modi's government was elected for another term, and the right wing's power was kind of cemented. Just like my sister, many, many more journalists have been killed over the years, and the media is being silenced again and again. We have the highest number of journalists killed in 2021, which is quite scary and deplorable. And I don't know what it says about our freedom of press. The Freedom House, which is a US-based organization, has downgraded India from a free democracy to a partial democracy. Along with this, of course, the religious polarization, lynching and violence in the name of religion everywhere.
और एक बार बोल बे जय श्री राम और एक बार बोल जय श्री राम जय हनुमान बोल जय हनुमान.
It's a very grim situation. But I know if Gauri was here, she wouldn't have thought of it like that. Gauri was a very positive person, she would only see hope in the numerous resistance all across the country. Like the nationwide protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is an act that brought in a religion-based criteria for citizenship of the country. And then there was the farmers' movement against the new farm laws, which they wanted to leave the farmers at the mercy of big corporate companies. I'm sure she would have been there. This movement went on for 1 whole year before forcing Mr. Modi to backtrack on the farm laws. Yeah, I'm sure Gauri would have loved to be there. She would have been in the streets, writing, reporting, investigating furiously, seeing hope where many of us could only probably see despair. Maybe that was the idea when they killed her, to kill hope itself.
Kavita, please join me on stage.
Hi,
Welcome. Hi.
Hi.
Kavita, you made a beautiful documentary about your sister.
Thank you.
It must be also touching to see that again and again, I feel. It's so personal and it's, but where to start? I believe you say in the documentary, for your sister, the Constitution was her religion.
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
I think basically because we were brought up under Mr. Lankesh, P. Lankesh was my father, who believed in the Constitution more than anything else, and he believed in secularism. He respected every religion. He wanted peace. He wanted, I mean, we grew up in that kind of culture where there was theatre, films, literature.
Yeah.
So we were never against a particular religion, or we didn't see any hatred or any polarization. And I think it was a much more safer and secular and beautiful world back then, I think. I mean, when my father, he used to bring down governments through his writings, especially his newspaper was very, very popular in the 80s, 90s. And he was always, and in fact, he was never for any particular government as such. He always did his job as a journalist as an opposition party, Yeah, exactly. His newspaper did that job, and he was very, very popular. And so we came in that culture, and Gauri, in fact, followed his footsteps and his idealism, I think, in her newspaper as well.
Great.
So,
and was that the same for you? Is that why you chose to be a filmmaker?
Absolutely, I think so. I think we were surrounded by, as I told you, people like Girish Karnad or your Anantmurthy, who was a stalwart writer on the theatre. All these people were around us all the time when we were growing up. So we, in fact, my father, it was very funnily, I say, he never gave us any money for clothes or anything like that at that time. But we were a very, very middle class or under that. But even in spite of that, he would give us a blank check to go to, bookshop and buy books. So that, I think, opened up a whole new world for us.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's very important to read. And Gauri and me, in fact, would never go to bed without reading a book every night.
Yeah.
So we grew up in that culture, I think.
Yeah. Great, great. And so this November, it's 5 years ago that your sister was assassinated.
Yeah.
September 5th, yeah. Did you, I think in the documentary you say, I never expected this to happen to her.
Yeah.
What has been the effect on you that this has happened?
No, see, as I told you, even when my father was writing and bringing down governments or exposing every corruption, there was hardly any threats at that time, The maximum some would probably do was protest in front of our office or pelt some stones at the office kind of thing. So, in fact, me and my father would go for walks, or he never ever had a bodyguard in his life and nothing like that. And when Gauri was, in fact, people around her told us there might be some threats for her life, or not really life, but maybe somebody would attack her. She laughed it off. And when I laughed it off because I always thought she was not as big as my father, because I knew, she was not just a journalist, because my father was mainly a journalist. Gauri, I think, had transcended to become an activist as well.
Yeah.
She got down on the streets, whatever she wrote, she would stand with the people's issue and make sure she would intervene with the government, with the people, and bring some action possible from the government.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
what she did. She took a step further from my father, I think.
Yeah, it was not only covering the story, but actually trying to get the change done that she covered.
Right, not just in the journalistic way or writing about informative way.
Yeah.
But she stood for every issue. I mean, I remember in the documentary, the complete documentary, where she had actually fought for, the land rights for people in the forest. So there were some 3,000 people evacuated at that time, and she went and fought. Stood with them with the issues, and she intervened with the government. And after she went away, after 3 years, when I went to shoot this documentary, I realized they had built about 1,000 houses for them. So this is what she was fighting for, and she made sure it happened. So that is a beautiful part of Gauri, I think.
Definitely, that's very admirable. Yeah. You kind of touched upon this already, but there was a difference between the type of journalist that your father was and that Gauri was. Do you think that actually, because she took that extra step, did that make her more of a target?
I think so, in a way, because also she was much more closer to the people, because it was not just standing by and writing about it, but she also went, as I told you, stood with the people, voicing out. She would call me every other day, every other week. She would, in fact, sit on there was a place called Town Hall in Bangalore with this, steps, and they would go to protest there. And she would be there at least weekly once, or she would go to various parts of Karnataka with the issues of the people. And also one more thing, I had in fact asked the same question if she was a threat, because she was writing for the regional paper, not really a national paper.
Yeah.
Somehow regional paper, I think, was, it got people to be more closer to what she was talking about, so the local people would know what she was talking about, whereas the national paper would address probably only the elite English reader
it's
people,
further away from...
So this got her more to the grassroots people, and that's where they could understand what the issues were about. So I think she was absolutely a threat because of that as well.
Exactly. in the documentary, there's also a small, and I think also in the clip we just saw, there's a small portion about the investigation. How is that for you as a sister? Was it, is it to you, did it serve justice in your view, or was there, I mean, there can never be justice, of course, when your sister is killed, but do you think they found the people that actually did this, or is that still unclear?
I mean, ever since she was assassinated, after that, this third day, there was a SIT formed with a 100-strong team from the Karnataka government at that point. And I have been in touch with the investigation team every week or every fortnight once, till today, in fact. And in fact, I'm happy that I know there's never be justice and there'll never be Gauri coming back, of course. But the SIT team did a wonderful job because of the kind of meticulous investigation they did, in spite of it being a very, very tough case.
Yeah.
Because of the meticulous job they did, it's not just Gauri's case that was kind of solved, but also Mr. Pansare, Dabolkar and Kalburgi, who were also assassinated for the same reason in the same group of people. So the entire connection has come forward, and it's been revealed in the investigation that all these murders were done by the same group of people. So I'm happy about that, but the fight continues for me, because just about 3 months back I had to intervene with the Supreme Court because they were all about to be, that some accused had applied for bail, and if they come out in Indian judicial system, I mean, it's very good, but at the same time it's very slow because of the number of cases which are there in the court. I mean, thousands and lakhs of cases, so it's very difficult for the court to really come to hear. And after 4 years, finally, the last 2 days back, it was announced that the trial is going to start. And on May 27th, I've been summoned to the court. And hopefully the trial starts soon, and the accused get their rightful punishment. And
exactly, yeah. And apart from this, did this change your filmmaking as well? Obviously, you made the documentary. Why did you decide to do that?
Actually, I'd been wanting to make a feature film on her, but of course it's a much more bigger budget and much more. But it's been, thankfully, when somebody told me that this kind of documentary is being commissioned by Free Press Unlimited, I had kind of both whether to apply or not to apply itself was a big decision, and there was a lot of confusion because I could imagine the journey I had to go through, reliving Gauri in a way.
Exactly.
It's been very, very traumatic, and half the time I was crying behind the scenes.
Of course, yeah.
At the same time, I was also very proud of what she stood for, because when I met the people she was involved with in terms of the issues she fought for, I was proud of the issues that she stood for. But Free Press Unlimited finally kind of selected as one of the projects to be made, and I'm very happy, because I hope Gauri's voice, before she died, it was very local and also national.
Yeah.
But after she was assassinated, there's been a worldwide kind of interest, and also because it's important, the kind of what she stood for should be heard all over the world, I think.
Yeah.
And I hope through Free Press Unlimited and through this documentary, which goes hopefully to many more people, it changes the world, because the world has become very, very polarized, very, very divisive, and and especially now in Karnataka, what we are facing, it's been so communal in the last few months. So I hope, and as you know, this kind of fascist kind of regime and the mentality is filling all over the world, I think. And I hope this documentary can make a slight difference to get into more humanitarian values and issues that are more important.
Definitely. That's really what she stood for. Huh?
Yes,
like she was seen as opposition, but what she actually wanted was more harmony and more respect and more. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
And for you, for the future, do you think you'll focus more on the topic of the courage that journalists have and they're showing within society?
I think so. See, in a way, I mean, Gauri's friends have always been my friends, and whole involvement in that. And after she's passed away, it's been more so for me, actually. And it's also been my more involvement in the politics around. And then it was always, my voice was through my films. And right now it's much more politicized, I think, because of Gauri and because of the kind of scenario that's happening around. There's been what can I say, an awareness, much more awareness in me, and I hope to bring this forward.
That would be great. And for the rest of your family, like what's been the effect of what has happened to Gauri and what happened since? Is there other people who are also more vocal or more working on these types of issues?
Absolutely, I think. I mean, Gauri's family is not just as I think, It's huge because even when she was assassinated and when we were burying her, the police, the team said, can just her close family come forward? And I looked back and I saw all these people whom I think she considered more of a family than us because she would spend so much more time with them, resolving issues, being with them and, being close to them. So this it's not just journalists. Her family was much more, it's a cross-section of people and especially the youth as well, whom she had inspired. And so I think that's a whole lot. And yes, they continue to voice out. Somebody like Tista Settleworld, who was her close friend and a lawyer and a journalist as well. I think they continue undaunted. And I think that's important. There are thousands of people like that. And that's the hope I see. Otherwise, I don't see much hope because there are all these groups around, and only time you see the negative, hateful, negative, messages or news, and it's filled, and you feel a sense of despair. But when I see people like Tista or Shiv Sundar or colleagues and thousands of other people, like-minded people who believe in secularism, who believe development, maybe we need to have more good roads, better public health, maybe better education system than all this religion-based bigotry. I think that's where we should concentrate on, and hopefully it will happen.
I think that was beautiful because that's actually, you touched upon this. You said, Gauri always saw hope, and that was her motivation, and I think we should try to do the same.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you, Evelyn.
We look forward to see the documentary in full. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
So later on, we'll have everyone on stage, and you'll be able to ask some questions. For now, may I ask Jos to come and join me on stage?
Hey.
Hi. Jos, you're my colleague at Free Press Unlimited. You work on a project called A Safer World for the Truth. You're the research coordinator. Let's start with the project. What is it about?
So the project is basically about investigating cold cases of journalist murders. So we really work at the, let's say, top of the iceberg of repression of journalists. And what we aim to do by investigating these cold cases is contributing to hopefully preventing such murders to take place in the future.
Exactly, yeah.
We saw, of course, I think it was really telling the end of the documentary by Kavita. Perhaps by murdering Gauri, they also tried to murder basically hope. And unfortunately, I think there is a lot of truth in that beyond the case of Gauri and even India. What we see in many contexts is that there's good reasons to believe that these acts of repression, murder, are really aimed at not just murdering one person, not just silencing one person, but really send out a message to that whole community that is the price of criticism. And what we hope to do is, by investigating these cold cases, is to, of course, try to bring those to justice that are behind those murders, but also to send out a message that murdering a journalist does not always go unpunished.
Yeah. Exactly. That's very important. I think that's something we haven't touched upon yet, and maybe you can say a bit more about that. Gauri was a local journalist working in the region. I think we see that more, that they are more vulnerable, that those actually working in the capital have more protection. They're closer to actually the government often. They're closer to the power. So it's harder to touch them, I guess. Is that something you've seen in the other investigations that have been done within the project as well?
Yeah, without a doubt. It's absolutely right what you're saying. Especially, of course, in these large countries like India and Mexico, the Philippines. These are dangerous contexts for journalists nowadays. And you're absolutely right. I mean, journalists that are outside of the limelight of the capital, so to say, are much more vulnerable. Absolutely. In Mexico, for example, if you look at certain states, journalists have a 50 times higher percentage of chance to get murdered than compared to people in the city center of Mexico City.
Yeah.
So
then it's very targeted at what they're actually trying to do, what they're trying to reveal, what they're trying to tell. It's not about they're part of a system that's actually violent, but they're actually a target because of the work they do.
Oh, they're absolutely targeted, of course. That's always, I mean, a problem to prove, because one of the issues with journalist murders is that in many cases they don't get solved, right? There is impunity. And when there is impunity, there is also this debate, of course, about were they targeted for their work or not. So we don't always have all the information at hand to prove it, but there are ways nowadays, and everything indicates that they're targeted for their work. So yeah, we're learning more and more about it, and I think that's safe to conclude.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder, is there any involvement from the family in the investigations you do? Because we saw, obviously, with Kavita, there is a very clear motivation to tell the story, to be part of, finding justice for her case. Is that also true for the other cases that you've taken up?
Yeah, the cases where I work on, there is collaboration with the family, absolutely. Yes, and that's something that surprises me, or at least not surprises me, that's something that inspires me, at least, that the family often has such a long breath. I mean, you have to imagine that the cases that I work on, they're already going on for more than a decade. So that means that the family has seen a partner being murdered, and thereafter has insecurity with regards to their own safety, right? I mean, impunity has an effect on the safety of the next of kin, basically. So that's deeply problematic. But the cases that I've seen, the family members are very, very, very involved, and they're still trying to achieve justice. And even after 10 years, I was speaking to someone from Brazil recently, and that woman told me, the widow told me, I mean, I know I'm not going to get my husband back. I know that very much, but I'm doing this for the journalist community, and that was really meant, and that's inspiring.
Yeah, it is. And it also obviously makes a lot of sense. If it's your partner or your father or whoever, then I think many times you'll be touched by the work they do, and they are very motivated to do it, because if there's so much danger that they actually get killed for it, then the kind of situation, the context that they work in must be challenging as well. So you must be really...
You must be toughened.
Exactly, yeah. So I can imagine that. What do you think about the role of documentaries like Kavita's for the work that you do? Is that important? Does it help?
I mean, without a doubt. So public pressure, I think, is extremely important in these contexts. I mean, one of the paradoxical things nowadays is that the places where a lot of murders take place are also democracies, right? There are these countries like India, Mexico, the Philippines. I mean, perhaps they're imperfect democracies, but the freedom of the press is guaranteed by the constitution, right? So that's why they're working there. And I think there are ways to still put pressure on the authorities, and if there is no information about these murders, then that's going to be hard, right? So these documentaries and reporting about this is extremely important, I think.
Yeah, to create the public kind of demand and attention for justice, and yeah.
Absolutely, and even, like, for example, even prosecutors, investigators, judges, they don't make decisions in a political vacuum, right?
No.
They're susceptible to public pressure, although they perhaps would not like to admit that. I think that's still the case, and the signals that we're getting also confirms that. I think I'm working for the same Brazilian case, for example. I was talking with a lawyer. We are having our legal strategy there to get access to the case files, and they were asking us as well. Can you please also think about creating public pressure, because that might help. So therefore, these documentaries might also help, of course.
Yeah, of course, to get the attention of the people. Do you see any hope in the work that you do, like going forward? Like what can we do to support these really courageous journalists and these families that are seeking justice?
That's a good question. I mean, these are not hopeful times, obviously, and the honest answer is that there is a lot of work to do, and things are not going to be are not getting better per se. But hope is definitely there, especially seeing these family members, former colleagues of murdered journalists that keep on reporting about it. They seem to have such a long breath, and they seem to not want to give up. So even in these times, I see
That's
hope in that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are definitely ways to help, right? I think that investigations into, for example, cold cases of murders should take place much more often. We should create an environment where journalists can also report about murdered journalists. I can think of multiple things that are still necessary.
Definitely, yeah. And I think also what we've seen in the last couple of years in certain, I think the numbers of like totally around the world of journalists killed has gone down a little bit, which sounds like things are going better and are improving. But at the same time, we've seen many laws being introduced that actually make it easy to lock up any journalist that is critical of those in power. Do you see that correlation as well, that kind of they're finding other ways to silence the people that are trying to speak up and tell the stories that are not to be heard?
Oh, that's absolutely the case. I mean, that means we're backsliding even more, I think. I mean, we knew that from before this period, right? I mean, in China or North Korea, we didn't hear much about journalist murders, right? No. I mean, that doesn't mean that doesn't take place, but there are good reasons to believe that there are other good measures, namely you can safely put them into prison, or there is a situation where it becomes completely unlogical to report about something in the first place. For example, Korea, just to take this as an example of an extremely closed place, right? That doesn't mean that whenever there are journalist murders that it's a good sign, of course, but it's a sign that there is uncertainty, right? That there is, on the one hand, people still dare to write up to the point that they get murdered for it.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's something that's a nuance to take into account when we look at these murders. Therefore, these indexes, I think, are very important. That takes into account both how many journalists are murdered, but also threatened or jailed, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was really insightful. I think I'm going to ask everyone who was here before to join me on stage, and then we can see if there's any questions from the audience to you. Oh, if there's any chairs coming. Yeah, they're coming. Ja, kom blijven zitten. No, go ahead. I said all this time. Go ahead.
Do you want to come closer? Yes.
Thank you. I think there's a mic going around if someone has there's a question over there.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so deeply moved and in much gratitude of your courage and the stories that you're putting out into the world. Kavitha, my question is for you. I would love to see the film. That's my first question. Where do we get to see the film? And I loved I'm not usually a fan of voiceover, like the voice of God, but your personal connection to the story and to your sister, and the shot of your mother, that scene of your mother speaking to a crowd, so deeply moved me. I thank you so much for making this film and for having the courage to do so. But my main question really is, where do we get to see this powerful film that you've made and created?
Hopefully soon. Thank you so much for liking it. I also don't like voiceovers, so actually decided it should be a personal journey of mine, because it's also not just, it was about Gaudi, but it's also my transformation and how I see it. And I thought that would give the connection to the larger audience in terms of, because it's personal. Because I don't want to make a political, it should be political through the personal, I think that way. So thank you for liking it, and I hope you can see it soon. I'm just in the final rough correction and sound, we're just doing the 5.1 and everything. In another month or so, I hope you can get to see it everywhere. Looking for distribution right now. A couple people have come forward, but I just need to know who can really distribute it. It's not just about money, it's also about reaching out to the maximum number of people across the world. So I hope I find the right company or a person soon, yeah. Yes, please. I'll share you my contact details with you and send you a personal link soon, yeah. Thank you so much, yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions from the room? Yeah.
Thank you for these disclosures. It's interesting to me. It's a little bit new to me, actually. I always felt that there was laws that would help the press and that would defend your rights to produce your work. But you're saying now that many of the countries you represent, there's new laws, or, I mean, how does this change? I don't understand how this can change.
Thank you. I think that's a question that all of you might be able. Anu, can you maybe give a start?
Yeah, just to start off with the new laws that have been introduced in Bangladesh. It's quite a broad law that can charge any journalist for reporting on government affairs. So if we talk about the clauses that have been introduced in the media accreditation guidelines in India, if a journalist writes about government affairs, then it can very easily be considered as going against the sovereignty and integrity of the country. So in this case, it's easy to charge them. So when these new laws are more broad and are meant to target journalists, we see that journalists self-censor, which is also coming back to what you asked, Yos. The number of deaths going down doesn't necessarily mean that they have more freedom. It simply means that they're scared for their lives and their jobs, so they are going on self-censoring. And the Kashmir situation now is still quite worrisome because there are new levels of content regulation that the media outlets have to do, which is now leading to media outlets just shutting. For example, a very leading daily called Kashmir Times had to close down. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I understand a little bit, but it really targets journalists. So how do you define a journalist?
How do you define a journalist? Okay.
That's a tricky one. Yeah.
You're still.
It really depends, right? I think this is one of the main issues for everyone. I think obviously a journalist reports about something of public interest, in the first place. Whether case by case someone is a journalist or not, I think it depends on the context. I think, for example, in the Netherlands, it's not a protected profession. I think there are countries where it is a profession, where it's more clear and it's easier to define someone as a journalist. But yeah, one of the things I think we're also dealing with is that, of course, it's not. I mean, the people that are targeted are not always the stereotypical journalists. I mean, they're also, I mean, I think they're most, it's about the fact that they bear information with them, right? Compromising information that they want to spread in some sort of meaningful way. So they can also be information activists. Right to information activists in India are also, is a subgroup of people that is also targeted. These are not per se journalists, but they have a similar function, right? They report about something of public interest, et cetera, et cetera.
If I can continue, journalist is anybody that brings information forward. But I think today we're very specifically talking about investigative journalists or those that, that report on government affairs. They can be photojournalists, fashion journalists, but they don't face the same threat that an investigative journalist, for example, faces. In Pakistan, for example, when there was the Me Too movement, it was very easy to call a journalist and charge them under libel for defaming a politician or a celebrity or a leader. So it also started to slowly go over and cross the borders of investigative journalism in certain cases. But yeah.
And I can see that there are similar patterns with Afghanistan as well. So we have a few journalists, most of them international media representatives who are in Kabul and who receive attention from the whole international community and the other activists inside the country. But then we have citizens, community members who report on things happening around the country, who are not necessarily a professional associated with a station, but more like in a border between activism and reporting. It turns out that this pattern specifically somehow treats the Taliban. They don't go after big names, they don't go after established journalists, but rather they would go to the community members who are not professionals but who contribute on first-hand reporting from the things happening there. And I can say I was moved with my colleague Zaki's speech. Maybe I'm slightly a bit more not optimistic in this term. He was talking about hope, and he was talking about the media that hasn't been the media that's not yet destroyed. When I heard Zaki, I realized that I have been missing to mention these individuals like Zaki and his team who have been reporting about Afghanistan. But in fact, I still do believe that there is nothing as independent journalism exists in Afghanistan anymore, rather individuals who are willing to take risk and who are willing to continue this path for reporting. And I was so moved to hear that Zaki, as a journalist, is talking about hope, while we are all, this is something we're all looking for, but we can't really find that. So on that regard, it makes me hopeful as well to see that there are individual voices who maybe in the future find ways to report from the country. But I do really echo on Zaki's request from Free Press Unlimited to come to Afghanistan. This is the moment that we need the most, that we need this international recognition as the people and as the community of activists who really need that. And it also, when you asked me, Evelyn, about whether I'm planning to return or not, right now I don't belong there because my community doesn't exist there. My family doesn't exist. The professional community that I was a part of doesn't exist. Yeah. So if organizations like Free Press Unlimited and other organizations that supports the freedom of expression and journalism, if they do go to the country, this gives us a reason to at least feel that we are a part of something, and at least feel that there will be someone who would raise voice if we are in danger. So this gives us like a sense of being connected to a broader community. You're not alone anymore. So I really echo on Zeki on that regard.
Great, noted. Just a follow-up question on that. For you as a filmmaker, is it different, or do you experience the same? Like when you were back in Afghanistan, did you experience a lot of threats or anything related to what we talked about that these independent journalists face?
Well, yeah, this somehow relates to the question that you asked, whether who is journalist, because in Afghanistan context, usually filmmakers are considered as journalists as well, because they have a camera and they talk to the people. But there are lots of there were lots of technical issues that we would face as people who would spend more time with the characters and with the stories rather than daily or weekly reports. But the whole context was the same. But right now, it really doesn't matter whether you are a filmmaker or whether you're a journalist. As soon as you have a camera, you're automatically considered as a threat. But there is, just to mention, there is a small number of YouTubers who report, but there's nothing critic about that. You know, it's all about the, traveling in the roads that were unsafe before, and just, the very human right to just talk with the people without being treated. We can see the country from that lens, but there's nothing critic about it. There's no real reporting.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Is there more questions from the room?
If you don't mind, I have one more question.
Of course.
As all of you are journalists, I'm wondering, I had a career for 40 years doing electronic controls, and of course, we challenged many things about safety and making things better, and I mean, that's how we all made our careers and got successful. I'm wondering, in journalism, is there a line that you can see where you're maybe not being thought to be safe, that you're going to cross this line? Because I think many times I've challenged generals of the military and the heads of Boeing and challenged them on their approaches, but I never felt there would be threats against me. And I wonder if in journalism, do you know this, that there is a line, that you see this line, that you know you shouldn't cross it, or in your own situations? Are you taught this?
Elias, I think, is the best
It's totally
person.
different in Afghanistan context, because reporting, journalism, storytelling is never a career choice for us. It's not something that we want to do for a living. Of course, we earn money with that, but at the end of the day, it's a struggle to survive. It's a mean of expression. So the question of safety never comes first for us. It comes on the very last minute before releasing, that we just sit down for a minute and think about our safety. But nothing about reporting in Afghanistan is safe. For the films that we make right now, every step that we take out of our office and out of our home is totally unsafe for us. I've been working on a documentary for the past nearly 5 years. It starts with a suicide, actually, a young girl, a student of Kabul University committing suicide. So for the past 5 years, we are following this story, but at the same time, we needed to evacuate the whole 9 members of the family so that we would be able to patch, present, and release the film later this year. So the question of security is the first question that comes, but it is the last question that we deal with, because it's the reality.
Yeah. I can say from the Free Press Unlimited perspective, I think it has become a lot more prominent in the work that we do. So in supporting independent media and journalists, I think about 6 years ago, it was a topic we did work on, but I think now it's the main topic we do work on. So we have these emergency funds, we have these legal funds to defend journalists. We, especially with these crises in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, these are contexts where we work, and we see that there's a huge demand for safety for journalists, for them to go out, and for emergency visas when they've reported on something that's very sensitive. It's very sad, of course. It says something about the kind of polarization and the position they're in within society. Yeah. I wanted to ask you also a bit about this, because I think it's something we also see in the investigations, that there are kind of red lines. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on this.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's all, these red lines are often very blurry, unfortunately. I mean, perhaps in some contexts there are red lines, and actually we have certain cases where that seems to be the case when when journalists write about a specific really influential family, for example, everybody knows that that will have consequences. But generally speaking, these red lines are more blurry than we would maybe like to think, because otherwise, why would there be so many journalists murdered in the end, right? I mean, most of these journalists, I would say, do not expect to get murdered. There are some, I've spoken actually to journalists that predicted that something would happen to them, but many actually think, no, it will not happen to me. I'm on the right side of the red line, and unfortunately these red lines shift all the time. Things can escalate, things can get worse. So unfortunately, we shouldn't rely on these red lines too much.
Kavita, you wanted to add to that?
No, in India, of course, Gauri was offered, security by the government when she thought she had some kind of a threat. First, she laughed it off, saying it's not really a threat as such. But when she was offered, she said, which kind of, a journalist would actually go with government security to do any investigative journalism or anything at all? Because she was always against the government, whichever the party was, especially, of course, the BJP and the RSS. But really, no rightful journalist would go with a platoon of security given by the government. So I think, and also there's been a lot of censorship ourselves in terms of as a filmmaker or even as a journalist in India, because the kind of cases that are being slapped on you. When Gauri died, she had about 85 cases on her. So that's a lot. So they try to keep them active, just attending these cases in remote places, So she's not ready to write. She has no time to write or really do any groundwork, but she's attending these cases. But one good thing she did was she made her own kind of friends and whole, a group of like-minded people who would again fight for the constitution and secularism in each little town she went to. So that was the beauty of her. She took that opportunity to do that. But how many people can really do that? Right now, The Wire, for instance, has been slapped with 100 crore, by the Ambanis or, people like that all the time. So where do they have time to really work peacefully at actual information or investigative journalism, but instead of attending these court cases all the time? So, and filmmakers, of course, we have something called censorship in India. So some of the films don't get censored at all, so that you can't release the film, especially if it's against the government. So, or if it's pro-government, like the one which is right now very popular, the Kashmir Files, is being completely propagated by the government because it fits in with their agenda. So, so it goes on.
I think also security is not only physical security now; it's quite broad in this current context. We also have to think about digital security, and then speaking of digital security, then the red line is always very much closer to you. In Pakistan, we have journalists reporting that their social media accounts were hacked, or there were attempts made, and massive trolling of female journalists, especially. A study that was done by UNESCO and ICJ showed 3 out of 4 women report online violence. So they've experienced death threats, rape threats, and then 1 in 5 women respondents said that there were physical attacks made on them because of incidents that seeded online. So now it's getting more and more closer and real, and it can attack you even at home. I think we also have to consider the trauma, the PTSD that journalists go through. It's very real.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also the sad thing about this, I think in the same study, it also showed that it led to a certain portion of these journalists to actually leave the profession because of all of this, which, yeah, I think is a really sad consequence that they don't get to speak out anymore. Any more questions at this point? Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm also now thinking about, as you talk about this red line, how do you now define truth when there's activities going on and maybe you don't want to report it completely the way you saw it, but maybe twist it a little bit to try to stay inside this red line? So how does truth now get defined in this world where journalists are sort of living in this threatening world?
I'm not sure who of you wants to
Who dares?
answer.
Well, I come from a country where truth is not really reliable, especially when you hear it from the mainstream media. In fact, the mainstream media has shaped the whole narrative of the war and the way that the world looks at us. So on that regard, I would say at least personally for me, the best way to preserve the truth would be to give voice to the peoples from within the community, to give voice for the inner voices of the community and to the locals who live and experience on a daily basis what's going on, rather than having, I can say, a heli view, a helicopter view towards the people who are living there. Every time that I talk about my film and about things happening, I always attack the mainstream media because we have suffered a lot from how they have reported and how they have shaped us to the world. So on that regard, being able to talk about ourselves without having this perspective of outside installed on the frame, I think that's how I would approach the truth in journalism, a local and insider view to the things happening.
I'm myself not a journalist. I work with journalists in implementing projects from FPU in repressive countries. So, I cannot answer the question of truth, but I think that when free press is, the freedom of press is dismantled by laws and regulations by an individual official, I think they take away the only weapon that the public have against corruption and abuse of power. So the idea is to just keep fighting and to provide a very supportive environment to the journalists that are still there and reporting.
And reporting from Afghanistan is becoming more and more difficult because there's not any resources left to approach, to confirm the stories that you're working. And there's a debate ongoing in social media about the fake news and the news that you could rely on. And some pro-Taliban media activists suggest that every news that has been confirmed by the government, so-called government, should be considered as the truth. While we are dealing with a government whose roots are based on lies and based on anything but not the truth. So it's becoming more and more difficult to find the truth.
Similarly, I think in India, most of the major newspapers are being owned by corporate firms, and so the corporates are always in cahoots with whichever the ruling government is. So it's becoming, earlier at least, there used to be some kind of a C page, as they call, of information or corruption, a little space. But right now it's been covered completely. If you take a newspaper, there's articles from the running government covered by them all over the newspaper. And there, of course, the television channels which are owned by corporates. So it's they're basically becoming like the pamphlets, handouts of the government. So similar to what you said, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. if there are no more questions, I'm going to ask you if you have any final comments before we close. Any hopeful comments, maybe even more?
Well, perhaps one final comment is that, or at least from my side, is that what sometimes strikes me, I'm also not a journalist, by the way, but what I like to take as an example of something that gives me hope is that, for example, in contexts like Mexico, there's so much violence taking place. So many journalists get either murdered or disappear, for example. But what really surprises me sometimes is that the amount of people that remain defiant and remain to publish about matters of public interest, corruption, embezzlement. And that defiance really, I think, is something that gives hope, yeah.
Yeah, their courage and their perseverance, yeah. I agree. Well, let's close with that. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you.